Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Cup Chat. We missed everyone last Wednesday, but we were definitely getting ready for the newest program with the Birding with Extension, Learn to Bird, and we want to highlight our fancy mugs. Thank you, Miss April, for giving us some cute mugs for our new Cup Chat. I do have my coffee with my caramel macchiato creamer in mind today. And so today we actually want to introduce our guest really quick. And joining us is Andrew Stillman, and he's a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut. And he's been doing some awesome research with black-backed woodpeckers and fire on our landscape. So we're going to dive into his research, all of his cool stuff here shortly. But also, Andrew really does have a cool mug too. So Andrew, show us your cool mug because it's super cool.
It's one of those mugs where the birds get their colors after you put hot water inside. And it's got a couple famous North American birds, including down here a scissor-tailed flycatcher.
Hey, nice. I like it.
We see that one a lot down here in South Texas. Now, Andrew, we just finished up our Learn to Bird program, which was a new program for birding with extension. Now, Maureen, how about you give a free 30-second commercial about what you loved about Learn to Bird? It was such a great weekend.
Yeah, I think one of my highlights, and this is kind of fun as we're talking with somebody who works in Eastern North America on birds that live in Western North America, my highlight was that we saw some really amazing species. So we had 4 species that are really considered Western species, and we're at the far eastern end of their range. So we found a Western screech owl who lives at McKenna Ranch. He's often there, and he was super cooperative. We had...
Thank you, Western screech owl.
Yes, thank you, Western screech owl.
It was getting chilly. I didn't want to have to go very far.
Yeah, and then we had a black and white gray warbler and a red-naped sapsucker and a female western tanager. And 3 of those, the owl and the sapsucker and the black and white gray warbler, all tripped a rare bird alert for the county because that's how uncommon it is to see them. And it's kind of fun when a rare bird alert shows up in your inbox and you were one of the ones you were part of the group that set that off. So yeah, I think that's what's awesome. This is just kind of turning this into a commercial for Birding the Border as well, is that's what's awesome about birding in the Del Rio area, is that you can truly see birds from so many different ecoregions and parts of the country, because we know there's, black-capped vireos out at McKenna as well. So that's very much like a Texas specialty. We've seen an Eastern screech owl out there as well as a Western. And so it's really just this blending point of all these different species and ecoregions. And that's why I love birding there, because you always get surprises.
Well, that's super cool, Maureen. And I hate to, Andrew, I know we're going to get to you, I promise, but we're going to give one more cool thing about our Learn to Bird program, and that I was so excited about, and that most of our followers don't know. It was a new thing. Was we gave out our first Birding with Extension species collectible sticker. So for those of you who haven't been following us on Instagram or Facebook, you have it with you?
Well, no, first I just wanted to show that we have
You're going to interrupt my 30-second commercial.
Yeah, I took longer than 30 seconds. You'll be okay. That we have a general Birding with Extension sticker, and then I don't have my species-specific one, although I did see it, so I don't know why I didn't get one, boss lady.
I don't know. Failure on the boss lady's part. But we have species-specific stickers for some of our more rare or highlight birds of our Birding with Extensions program, especially here in the Val Verde County area, what birds we're going to see at Learn to Bird or Birding the Border. And so we saw a black-tailed gnatcatcher at McKenna Ranch, which was a little odd for McKenna. I don't know that we really expected to see that there. And so all of our participants who saw that bird got their species sticker. And so we have 12 collectible species stickers, and I dare you to come find them all at one of our programs. And I just want to shout out to all the Learn to Bird participants. Y'all were awesome. We loved you. It was so great, and y'all had such great hearts and wanted to learn. And I think that was the funnest part to me. Was I almost cried when they told us what their goals were as we started Learn to Bird, and I hope they all got that out. But anyways, Andrew, your turn. So Andrew, you are an avid birder. You live on the West Coast. And so kind of East Coast, West Coast, wrong way. But let's talk a little bit, just in general about you being a birder before we dive off into your research. Maybe where's your favorite area to bird? Where do you want to go birding? What maybe that favorite bird is, or what's one bird you want to see? Give us some good details.
That's a great question. Well, I have a few different favorite places to bird. Here in Connecticut, I really like birding along the coast during especially fall migration. That's one of those times when, because the Connecticut coastline is a southern border before the Long Island Sound, a lot of birds will get funneled into certain points there. So it's a fantastic place to go birding during fall migration. In the Northeast, one of my favorite places to go birding is the Montezuma Wetland Complex, which is in central New York. It's right along the Finger Lakes region there. And it's a huge area where there's lots of waterfowl. There's bitterns, there's all sorts of amazing species. It's a big wetlands complex supported by conservation funds, especially from Ducks Unlimited, and some private donations as well. So it's a fantastic place to go birding there if you're ever in the area. Then out west, I do a lot of my work in California, and there's a lot of amazing places to go birding in California, especially because as a state, it's so diverse in the different landscapes and habitats that are available. One of my favorite places to go birding there is probably Point Reyes National Seashore. Incredible place where you can have great birding experiences within view of northern elephant seals. And that's just something that is a fantastic way to get out there and see some new bird species.
That's wonderful, Andrew. And I have to tell you, I've never birded in California, but I have spent a lot of time there for agricultural reasons. Everyone knows that I love me some ag. But I think that you're so hit the nail on the head is the diversity of habitats in California. Even as you just drive Highway 1, up and down the coastline, it just changes. So even within your day's drive can change, and you can be in so many little different habitats and find so many different little pockets of birds, I'm sure. So Andrew, tell us a little bit about the research you're doing out there.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I do my research mostly in California and also in Washington State, but I live in Connecticut. My advisor now, where I'm finishing up my PhD, is actually based at UCLA in Los Angeles. And so I'm in this situation where I'm being remotely advised, living in Connecticut, and then I've conducted many years of field work in Northern California especially. And I study the ways that birds respond to fire and use the habitat that's created after a fire burns. And so this is a very big question, and it's especially important times like this when there's a lot of burned habitat that's being created. And I think it's important to view these areas as potential places where birds can make a living. And some of these burned areas are actually very important for bird life with very diverse bird communities. So I study the ways that birds use those fires and respond to the variation left after the fire burns. So variation in the ways that the fire actually burns on the landscape will leave behind a lot of different kinds of habitat after the fire. And birds respond to that variation within the burned area. And I study how birds are responding to that in terms of things like nest success, habitat use, dispersal, those sorts of demographic processes that will drive populations.
And so what has some of that research shown you? What are the answers that you found?
Well, I think one important take-home message is that a burned forest is a fantastic place to go birding. It's actually a very rare habitat when you compare its availability to many other sorts of forested places. And after the fire burns, it leaves behind a lot of variation in that habitat. So you might have areas where all of the trees have died, but they're all left standing. So this is a pulse of dead trees, which is an important resource for many bird species and mammals and things like that as well. You also have areas where the fire burned just on the ground. Surface fire is what we call that. And that's where all the trees are left alive, but the underbrush and the herbaceous layer has all been replaced. And so there's a pulse of resources there as there's more ash on the ground, a lot of new plants grow, and birds come and use that habitat as well. And then you've got these edges between these places where there was high severity fire that killed all the trees and low severity fire where the trees are still alive. And these edge habitats are also really important places for birds. So we're learning a lot about how these habitats are valuable, but also how the I don't want to say value, but the benefits of this habitat to birds depends on how the fire burns and how big the fire is. So now some of these really giant severe fires that we're seeing in California are actually reducing the amount of variation in that post-fire landscape, and that can actually be problematic for many bird species.
Interesting.
So I think that's a really interesting point, is that I think I know for a long time in North America, we viewed all fires as bad. If there was any fire at all, we saw that as something not good happening on the landscape. And then slowly there's become this recognition that no, this is something natural, but it needs to happen a certain way, right? Not all fires are created equal. So I'm going to throw this out there. Emily likes when we talk about things that are a little bit hot topic or controversial. What is some of are there challenges that you run into when you tell people about like the benefits of fire, and kind of what is some of the fire culture out there? Do you have a hard time telling somebody, hey, it can be good if we burn a little bit?
That's a great question. And I think there's been a lot of cultural change in that regard just in the last 20 or 10 years, especially as we've seen some of these larger, more severe fires burning. Because these fires, especially the ones this year, drive home the point that the way forests have been managed in the past might not be the best way to manage forests. If we keep fire away from flammable forests, especially those forests out west, like in California and the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, if we keep fire away, it's called fire suppression, that actually paves the way for some of these giant, severe, and intense fires that we see. And those are the fires that are most damaging and dangerous to human life and property. And so if we introduce fire into the landscape in a controlled way, that actually can help reduce the risk of catastrophic fires happening.
And so I suppose this makes sense ecologically, but basically what you have found is that those fires that are the size kind of that they're supposed to be, they're a natural size, and we've got a range from that being something smaller like a surface fire, as opposed to we do sometimes need to kill all the trees, right? Like that's okay sometimes if fire kills all the trees. That's where the birds do best, and it's these mega fires that are basically created by artificial conditions because we've suppressed fire in that area. That's when it's harmful.
That's exactly right. And so one thread of my research is trying to figure out what the future of birds might look like in places like California that are experiencing increased megafires. And by megafire, what that means is a fire that's really, really big. They say more than 10,000 hectares, and I'm not sure exactly how to compare that size, but a very big fire that burns quickly and really hot, leaving really large patches of forest where all the trees have died. And like Maureen said, it's normal for there to be some patches of high severity fire where the trees are left dead. Especially in California, a lot of those areas have something called a mixed severity fire regime. And that's code for there's low severity and there's high severity, and there's mixes between the two of them. So there's patches where all the trees are dead and there's patches where all the trees are alive. But these megafires tend to burn larger patches of high severity. And that's something that seems to be out of the range of variation that most bird species are used to.
Well, and that's a great point. And I have a random question. So I read a little bit about your research on your website and on some of the articles that you shared with us. Tell us a little bit about this ladder system and how you are tracking these birds, because that seems super interesting and kind of scary.
That's great. How did you hear about the ladder system?
On an article I read.
Oh yeah, great. Okay, yep. So the ladder system was a lot of fun and also very scary, like you say. And so I'll set it up this way. So a lot of my research actually is through the lens of this one bird species called the black-backed woodpecker. And so first, I think I'll start by giving a little bit of background on that species, and then I'll jump into how we actually have developed methods to research this species. So maybe you've heard about the black-backed woodpecker before. It's in your field guide. It's a species that's more associated with the boreal realm of North America. They like places with a lot of conifer trees. And in North America, they live in some of the boreal regions of Maine, across the boreal forest of Canada. And then in the US, in the West, they actually come down through some of these more montane tracts of Washington and Oregon and the Cascade Mountains, and then in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And then they're also in the Northern Rockies. And the Sierra Nevada mountains in California is the southernmost extent of the range. So it's not a bird that you're going to see in Texas, although that would be amazing if you did. But it is a bird that you can see if you travel to someplace like Yosemite National Park or even Yellowstone sometimes. And this is a species that is incredibly interesting because it's highly associated with burned forests. If you want to see a black-backed woodpecker, your best shot is to go to a place that's burned very recently, especially if it burned in the last 2 or 3 years. That's where you go to see a black-backed woodpecker. Now that seems like a strange habitat to specialize on, right? We've done some research and shown that they're actually 12 times more common in a burned forest versus an unburned forest that was disturbed by beetle kill, even when some of the key habitat components are held equal. Burned forest is just where it's at for this species. And they like these places because they're a snag specialist. Snags are those standing dead trees that are left after the fire. And they need those snags because that's where they nest. They nest in dead trees. And they also love to eat the larvae of wood-boring beetles. Wood-boring beetles will come and reproduce in dead and dying wood. And so when a fire burns, a lot of these wood-boring beetles actually have little smoke sensors. They'll fly in, sometimes in huge numbers, and reproduce in these dead trees soon after the fire burns. And the woodpeckers come in to eat and feast on that pulse of beetle grubs. Some of these grubs can be really big too. We're talking 1 to 2 inches. So it's an amazing place. And it's kind of like this giant grocery store, this fast food chain where there's just tons of hamburgers in these trees, big juicy grubs, and the woodpeckers are specialized to eat those grubs. And so that's a really interesting part about this species biology. And I think it's also important to note that after the fire burns, those snags don't stay up forever. Dead trees will eventually deteriorate and fall down. And so we actually see the populations of black-backed woodpeckers in these burned areas tracking the rise and fall of this resource, of the snags. So the woodpeckers will colonize rapidly after a fire burns. I've seen woodpeckers foraging in areas that burned 2 days ago, which is just incredible to me. Then their population will reach a peak in California a couple of years after the fire burns when there's lots of grubs in those trees. And then eventually the snags start to deteriorate and fall down. And 10 years after the fire, the population is actually much, much lower. So we kind of see this bell-shaped curve where the woodpeckers colonize, increase, and then decrease along with those resources. So it's a very interesting species, and they're also threatened by some of the post-fire logging that happens in California. And we can talk about that a little bit later.
But that's where the ladders come in, is how you track this species.
Exactly. And so a lot of our research requires that we capture black-backed woodpeckers and place radio transmitters on them so that we can track their movements. Now, my research wanted to do this with the fledgling birds, with the young juvenile birds that have just left the nest, because we knew a lot about the habitat associations of the adults. We knew that they love high severity burn, and the more snags, the better. And because of these studies, we figured that as these megafires are burning and leaving larger areas of high severity and more snags, we figured that this would actually be a good thing for black-backed woodpeckers. But I wanted to study the fledgling woodpeckers to see what sort of habitat they used. But this proved really problematic because we didn't have a way to catch them. We tried a lot of different things. First, we tried using the same methods that we used to capture adults. And if you want to capture an adult black-backed woodpecker, what you do is you march into the burned forest, you set up a mist net, which you've probably talked about on this show before, where it's a very fine mesh net. The birds can't see it and they might fly into it and get stuck. Then we can take them out safely and work with them. And then you play a broadcast of a territorial sound right by the net. And we actually, one of our field technicians who was just brilliant, he actually 3D printed a black-backed woodpecker with movable wings doing a threat display. And we'd stand behind a tree and pull a string. And this 3D printed woodpecker, we'd mount it to a tree and it would move its wings like it was doing a threat. We'd blare that territorial call and the woodpeckers would come flying in and getting stuck in the net. So that's how we captured the adults. We tried that with the fledglings, nothing happened. They're not territorial. They're not defending their own territories right now. They don't start breeding until 1 year after they've left the nest. So that didn't work. So back to the drawing board, we got a net gun. Net guns are sometimes used to catch different kinds of birds. And so we thought, well, if we can shoot a net gun, then maybe it'll wrap around the tree and kind of press the bird against the tree lightly so we can kind of net it that way. That didn't work either. The net gun it was too difficult to aim. It was too likely to get stuck on things. And we never actually took it into the field to try it with a real bird because we were afraid of actually hurting a bird with that. So back to the drawing board again. We realized that if we were going to place radio transmitters on these young birds, we had to get them while they were still in the nest. That's when we can actually reach them and make sure that they can't get away. But there's a problem because this bird nests really high up, sometimes over 2 stories high, in these rickety old dead pine trees that have been burned, sometimes 10 years ago. And some of these trees are so wobbly that if you lean on it the wrong way, the whole thing could just fall over, and that's not what we want. So we had to figure out a way to actually reach these nests without touching the tree. And so we came up with this method that some woodpecker biologists have actually used before in different ways. It's called the guide extension ladder. I'm sorry?
So you weren't the first crazy person to attempt this.
I was not the first crazy person to attempt this. Definitely, we made some adjustments to the method and we took it to new heights. Everyone kind of will take a method that's existing and make it work for their research. And so we adapted it and modified it so that it would work for blackback woodpeckers in a burned forest. And that means we lug a 24-foot extension ladder into the forest. Sometimes we're carrying this thing for like 2 miles. And we stand it straight up next to the nest tree. So this is a ladder, it's straight up, and we have a climbing rope attached to the top, and we stake it down to the ground in 4 places. And so it actually functions just like the guy wires on a cell phone tower. You ever seen those? Where it's this giant tower, and just a little concrete base, but because of these guy wires, there's 4 of them, and sometimes many more for a much taller tower. This thing can actually stand up really straight, and it's quite secure. And we found that the ladder was actually really secure if we stand it up straight without touching the tree and not leaning against anything. And so then it's my job to climb up that ladder. I got climbing gear on and I hoist myself into the ladder, lock it down so I'm actually connected to the ladder and I can work hands-free. And then we're able to actually access the nest and bring the fledglings down that way.
I'm out. I'm scared of heights, Andrew. So go you. Don't. I'll be on the ground supporting you if you need help. I'm not going up a ladder like that.
I'm happy to be finished with that part of my field work as well.
So I have a question then about getting the tags on them. Were they, what type of transmitters were they? Like, were they a backpack transmitter? And just because a lot of our viewers probably don't realize, but typically when we're putting transmitters on birds, we shoot for them to be no more than about 3% of the bird's body weight. So how small were these little transmitters? If they're, eventually the bird will get bigger, but you're putting them on fledglings, pre-fledgling.
That's a great question. So before we did this study, we took a lot of measurements of how much these fledglings weighed and how much the adults weighed so that we can kind of properly get the weight right so it wouldn't affect the bird's behavior. And we bought transmitters from a company called Low Tech. And these were transmitters that were only 1.6 grams. So tiny. 1.6 grams is about like holding 2 paper clips in your hand. It's smaller than a penny. And then it's got like a 4-inch antenna that sticks out of the end. And
that's incredible.
It was amazing. And the technology keeps on getting smaller and smaller. We are hoping to maybe use something like a GPS tag where it actually collects the data by taking GPS points for us. But those transmitters are still at the level where they'd be way too big for something like a woodpecker. And they're actually quite expensive still. But that technology is on the way. And I hope in the next 10 years that we might see something like that. In our case, though, these tags were a pretty new development where rather than just having a single battery that lasts for, say, 10 weeks and then the battery just dies, this actually had a programmable battery, which meant we were able to have it last for a full 10 weeks of tracking during the summer, turn off to save battery, and then turn on for a few periods in the fall, turn off again over the winter, and turn back on in the spring. And this allowed us to actually keep tracking these birds for a full year. And I can talk about some of those really fascinating results later. But it was really neat that we were able to track birds for a full year with something that was so light.
Wow, well, why don't you go ahead and
That's
share,
awesome.
share that with us now?
Sure. So we started by tracking these birds during the summer. And I think I'll start by actually describing the first study that we did here was actually just on the adult woodpeckers. And I'll explain this one first, I think, because it sets the ground for some of our work that we did later. First, we wanted to see where these woodpeckers were nesting in these burned forests. And as expected, we found that they really liked to nest in places that burned at high severity with lots of dead trees. But the surprise here was that the woodpeckers, when they were nesting in an area that burned at high severity, they nested near the edge of that high severity patch rather than in the middle, where you think that there'd be more access to these dead trees. So why are the birds choosing the best habitat, but on the edge of the habitat? That's what made us interested in tracking the fledglings to see what's going on. And when we tracked these young woodpeckers and analyzed our results, what we found was that the young black-backed woodpeckers actually use a very different habitat than the adults. The adult woodpeckers like to use these areas with lots of snags because that's where the food is. That makes sense, right? You use the area where you've got food. But the young woodpeckers would actually leave their nest and fly straight to the areas that burned at low severity, where there are lots of live trees. And that's because when you're a young woodpecker, you don't need to find your own food. Your food gets stuffed down your throat by your mom. And so what they actually needed was places that were protected from predators, because a burned forest, when there's lots of dead trees, is a relatively open and exposed place. And if a Cooper's hawk or if a northern goshawk flies over, you could become lunch. So the young woodpeckers were choosing areas with high cover, and the adult woodpeckers were choosing areas with lots of food. And so it kind of is like this lesson about where we want to put our house in the neighborhood. If we're going to move into a neighborhood and have a lot of kids, then we want to put our house in a place that's close to the grocery store and close to the nursery, because both are very important places for us to go.
Yes, great point, great point. So Maureen, let's talk a little bit about how Andrew's research can kind of even relate to where we are in Texas.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I, knew this was something I wanted to hit on today, inviting somebody from the East Coast who studies on the West Coast to a program that's pretty much all about Texas. And I think this will be a little bit of a preview for what will be hopefully a future Cup Chat in a little while. But some of the work that I have been doing over the past couple of years is looking at birds, but particularly species of greatest conservation need, and how the abundance and diversity of species is different in burned and unburned habitats. And we've found some interesting results there. We're working on the analyses right now. But one of the things that's been really interesting is that in places that haven't been burned for a while, and we didn't necessarily get a very severe fire through, because trying to do a prescribed burn, there's a lot of variables, right? And so sometimes you have a more successful burn than others. We didn't find much difference. And it's kind of, when you put a few years into a study and you're like, it looks like it's the same in both areas. That's not kind of like the glamorous results that we think about getting. But I think we have some hypotheses for, why this may have happened. It may be telling us that, for the species that are here in Texas, it's not that big of a difference, for those areas, and maybe some of these species, at least for the Edwards Plateau region, for the Hill Country region, it may not be a concern for these species, as to whether it's burned or not. There may be other important factors that are kind of limiting their populations and their presence. But the other thing that we're considering is that it may be that the fire just wasn't severe enough to make a difference. So it's kind of that lightly burned versus an unburned, kind of looks the same. And if we can get a more serious burn, excuse me, I might sneeze. Okay, no, we're good. If we can get a more severe burn or multiple burns, and that's what's going to be done next, hopefully on one of these properties, is to have another burn and see if it just takes a while, it takes a few years of those return burns to where we actually see a difference. So that's what's the common theme here, I think, and kind of the takeaway is that the role of fire is something so important that for a long time we underestimated. And it's not, it's not as simple as fire versus no fire. Not all fires are created equal. There's, these different severities. It depends on what time of year you conduct the burns. These burns on our properties were winter burns, and that's, or, we kind of say growing season versus non-growing season. And so that can affect, the outcomes of the fire. And so it's fascinating to me because there's these themes that we can see, whether it's, regardless of the part of the country that we're in, as to how these fires, affect our wildlife. And from my standpoint too, being an extension, there's a huge outreach need for helping teach people, because kind of as I alluded to, there has definitely been a shift in the culture, but there's still a lot of areas, where there's a lot of hesitancy about burning, and especially because every so often, even a prescribed burn, if it gets out of hand, that memory sticks with people, and so there's hesitancy to do that again in the future.
That's a really good point. And I think it brings up the fact that birds respond to things besides just the presence of fire. They respond to the ways that fire changes the structure of their habitat. And so if we burn in a way that's meant to target things besides birds, in terms of habitat restoration or something more ground cover related, if the birds don't really care what's on the ground, then they might not respond to the habitat structure change after fire burns. But a more high severity fire is definitely going to change the habitat structures that matter to birds, trees especially. And so we definitely expect to see a response there.
That's a really good point. Especially some of our prescribed fires here on our land in Texas, we do so that there isn't a whole lot of damage to our trees. We're not, it's not a high severity burn to change that overarching complete habitat like we see in some of those larger, massive, and more severe fires that you're studying. So it's a very interesting
and one other thing that's definitely. And one other thing that's come up a lot in my research is how different fires are in different places, and how different areas, even within the same region, are actually meant to have different sorts of naturally occurring fires. And so in California, mixed is really good, where there's places that are high severity and places that are low severity. But in places like Texas is a huge and very diverse state. And the role of fire on the landscape is probably going to be quite different depending on what sort of landscape type you're in.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's definitely, in different parts of the state, there's different fire return intervals that are, from what's natural, meaning how often would fire normally occur there. And, in some of the wetter parts of the state, it's okay if you have fires more often, in somewhere like the Trans-Pecos, maybe a little bit less often, or they need to be less severe, because it gets so dry out there that if you have a big fire go through and then you don't get rain for a few years, it can be a lot more devastating. So, and I think that's a good point too. You're talking about the vegetation structure. That's one part of our data that we've not analyzed yet, is that we do have vegetation measurements from one place to the other. And I think something that's important too, so you're focusing on one species and we're looking at, multiple species. And this is something that I talk with landowners about a lot is, what is your target species and what are you trying to do? But when you're trying to do something like increase diversity, this has been found in a lot of studies, is that it can be pretty tricky because some things are going to benefit and some things are not. And one of the species we're looking at that's a species of greatest conservation need in Texas is the northern bobwhite. And so sometimes that structural change of opening up the habitat a little bit is really important, because they're a ground nesting bird and their little chicks, they need cover, but they also need to be able to move. And if you've got too much grass and too dense of vegetation, they can't move across that landscape. So a lot of our other species, we think of all of our, regular songbirds flying through the air, they don't really care how much the vegetation changes on the ground, or they may care less so. But for something like a bobwhite, that's pretty important. So so there's just a lot of different factors to consider there.
It's definitely a place where there's a lot of need for research. There's a lot of questions that remain, but we've learned a lot in the past few years, and it's been a very exciting field to be a part of. Yeah.
So I've got one more question for you. I don't know if Emily has anything to ask. We try to keep these around half an hour. I have a faculty retreat I need to get to here in a little bit. But as far as future research, and I've been a grad student, so I know on some days this is your very least favorite question, but what next? What are you hoping to do after you finished up? What are you hoping to continue this type of research? What happens next?
Great question. Well, I've got a couple things planned on the pipeline. One, in regards to black-backed woodpeckers, we've been doing large-scale population surveys now across over 130 fires in California for 10 years. So we've got lots and lots of population data. And now that we've learned that this variation in post-fire habitat is important for the species, I want to analyze those data across a broad scale to see if those same trends come out across the entire state, rather than just in my smaller scale studies on individual birds that I'm tracking. Second, this component about how fire varies across space and how the fires in Texas are different from the fires in Northern California, and even within one area, there's differences in how fire interacts with the landscape, I think shows that it's really important to study the impact of fire on biodiversity across really broad scales. And this hasn't been possible to do in the past because you need a ton of data that ideally would span an entire continent. So we need some sort of data set where there's bird surveys that have happened for the last years or so and are continent-wide. We have that data set now. It's called eBird. I'm sure that you're familiar with it. And so I'm actually, I'd like to, in the future, employ eBird data and some of the fancy sort of models that people use with eBird data to look at the impacts of fire on bird biodiversity across the continent. And then lastly, the more concrete thing is, well, if I want to work with eBird data, the best place to go is probably the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They're the ones that host that database, and they're also developing the methods to work with it. And so next year, after I defend my PhD, I'm going to be starting a postdoctoral position at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But starting out, not working with fire, I'm actually going to be working with eBird data and using eBird data to help inform wind energy development for the conservation of bald and golden eagles.
Wow,
that is awesome, and congratulations on already having a postdoc lined up. That's very exciting.
Thanks, I'm excited for the opportunity.
Speaking of golden eagles, shout out to Brian. He saw his first golden eagle in Texas the other day.
Yeah, for those of y'all that have watched us before, and our guide Brian Koch, who's really part of our Birding with Extension team, got to see one of those in Texas, which was pretty exciting.
Is there a sticker for that species?
No, they're not common enough for Del Rio, but maybe someday there will be.
I'll have to sit down here when one of our producers does a prescribed burn and try to get you to Texas to come hang out and see us do a prescribed burn down here.
I would love to be a part of that. South Texas is a place where I've never been birding, and it's definitely high in my bucket list. I would love to come down and join you folks for some birding, both in burned and unburned places.
So, and thank you, Andrew, for joining us from the East Coast to talk about the West Coast. And we'll bring it back home and do our 30-second commercial for Birding the Border. Andrew does seem pretty interested in getting some of our stickers, and we want to remind everybody that registration is open for our Birding the Border program. We have our beginner track, we have our photography track, and we have 4 trips every day that are not specialized that go out where we highlight private lands in Texas or restricted area accesses on some of our public lands. So we want to thank our partners and our friends at Texas Parks and Wildlife and the National Park Service who kind of give us those behind the scenes looks that we couldn't get at some of the areas that we get to go birding. So we're incredibly grateful and thankful to our partners. So check out our website, wildlife.tmu.edu/birding. You can see all of our programs and then also see all of our recorded kept chats. So if you hung around to the end of our live program and are watching us on Facebook, you know me, Maureen, we're going to throw out a giveaway.
You makes me nervous every time.
I know, and I love it. So since Andrew's here, we want to give away, what do we want to give away, Andrew?
Free trip to California to see the birds.
Oh gosh.
Ooh, let's see. Andrew wants to come to South Texas to bird. So what we'll do is, in honor of Andrew wanting to come to South Texas to bird, we will give away a free registration pass birding the border. So you'll have to still pick your trips, but we'll give away the pass that will get you here. So comment with the county or state that you are watching from on Facebook, and we will draw at our next Cup Chat. But see, you had to hang around till the end. all you people who leave early. So thank you, Andrew, and we're glad you inspired our giveaway today. And happy Wednesday, everyone, and we will see you next Wednesday. Bye, guys.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Thanks, Andrew.